All right. Hello, everyone. This is the Human Mind Project here, and we are going to go through um, just a little bit of the intro to psychology and how to think like a scientist, uh, specifically a psychiatrist. And the focal questions that we're going to want to learn here are: how can the human mind, with its quirks and imperfections, conduct studies on itself? And how can scientific and critical thinking steer us toward a clearer understanding of human behavior and experience? Okay, so we can get into it. So, a main definition that we're going to want to take into account here is the scientific method. Okay, now the scientific method is a way of learning about the world through collecting observations, developing theories to explain them, and using the theories to make predictions, right? So in any sort of scientific background or any sort of science, basically, the way that scientific studies are completed is through collecting observations. So getting a huge sample of the population and developing theories on them, right? Developing theories and coming to conclusions, right? So that's going to be really important as we move on through this chapter, and it's going to connect directly with the definition of a hypothesis, right? Right. So, and this is also very key to highlight as well, that psychology is a vast discipline, and we might do better to consider it to be a collection of disciplines composed of many overlapping fields of study. Two unifying qualities allow us to group all these fields into the category of psychological science. Firstly, psychology involves the study of behavior that, broadly defined, can include perceptions, thoughts, and emotions. And we will get into this after the three combining fields, right? Secondly, psychologists employ the scientific method in their work. On these grounds, we can define actual science of psychology as the scientific study of behavior, thought, and experience. And so that is essentially, moving away from the text, that is essentially what the actual study of psychology is. And that's what the Human Mind Project is going to focus on, as this is learning about the scientific study of the mind, which is psychology, and that it comprises of behavior, thought, and experience. Okay, so if we dive deeper into hypothesis and making predictions, okay, scientific thinking and procedures revolve around the concepts of a hypothesis and a theory. They both guide the process and progress of sciences. However, it is important to differentiate between these terms. A hypothesis, okay, we can clearly define a hypothesis here. It is a testable prediction about processes that can be observed and measured, okay? A hypothesis can be supported or rejected. And a scientific hypothesis must be testable. These rules are regularly broken by people claiming to be scientific. For example, astrologers and physics are in the business of making predictions. An astrologer might tell you it's a good time for you to keep quiet or defer important calls or emails. This sounds like a request to not even bother, right? So, aside from the text, moving away from the text, just to quickly discuss this, right? So your hypothesis is going to be grounded in a theory, right? And what the text is asking us to think about here is, what is it that why would an astrologer make such a prediction and say, defer your calls because something bad could happen if you answer the phone? That's not a scientific hypothesis. We can't test that. It's very vague. And that's why, if we look here at the actual definition of the hypothesis, anything that we do in science is going to be surrounded by things that are testable and falsifiable. That's exactly what we want, okay? All right, so let's move on to the scientific method here. So let's talk about, this is very important too. What does it actually mean to be a scientist, right? So a person who haphazardly combines chemicals in test tubes may look like a chemist, but he is not conducting science. A person who dissects a specimen just to see how it looks may appear to be a biologist, but this is not science either. In contrast, a person who carefully follows a system of observing, predicting, and testing is conducting science, right? Whether the subject matter is chemicals, physiology, human memory, or social interactions, right? So this refers back to our scientific method right here. This is me talking separate from the text. A person who carefully follows a system of observing, predicting, and testing is conducting science. That is essentially what the scientific method is, and that is what makes a good scientist, right? So let's read more in depth here about what the theory is, right? So in contrast to hypothesis, a theory is an explanation for a broad range of observations that also generates new hypotheses and integrates numerous findings into a coherent whole. In other words, theories are general principles or explanations of some aspect of the world, including human behaviors, whereas hypotheses are specific predictions that can test the theory or, more realistically, specific parts of that theory. Theories are built from hypotheses that are reportedly tested and confirmed. If a hypothesis is supported, it provides more support for the theory, right? So like I mentioned earlier, right, our theory is going to be grounded in our hypothesis, but the theory is essentially the first part. It is the explanation, as the definition says up here, for a broad range of observations, right? And it will generate a new hypothesis, but it is essentially how we ground the first part of our hypothesis, right? Okay, so another thing to look at too is if the hypothesis is not supported by the results of a well-designed experiment, then researchers may have to rethink elements of the theory. And this shows how hypothesis testing eventually leads back to the theory from which it was based. So we can go to figure point 1 here, but that's not too important. We want to really get into the definitions, right? So similar to hypothesis, an essential quality of scientific theories is that they can be provided false with new evidence. In fact, any scientific theory must be falsifiable. So any scientific theory must be falsifiable. Just as researchers can discover strong evidence in support of a theory, they can also discover evidence that challenges a theory. And it shows theories can be updated with new evidence, right? So this is very, very important. So these are three categories here that we really want to understand, and they're going to be very important to your foundation as a scientist, right? And number one is that theories are not the same thing as opinions or beliefs. Yes, it is certainly true that everyone is entitled to their own beliefs, but the phrase "that's just your theory" is neither the correct use of the term theory nor an argument that a scientist would make. So theories are not the same things as opinions or beliefs. All theories are not equally plausible, right? What does that mean? Groups of scientists might adopt different theories for explaining the same phenomena. For example, several theories have been proposed to explain why people become depressed. This does not mean that anyone can throw their hat into the ring and claim equal status for his or her theory or belief. There are good theories and there are not so good theories, right? So aside from the text to speak on this, there are several theories for why people become depressed, right? But because everybody is different and everybody may have a different sociocultural situation, biological situation, we can't really pinpoint one factor for why people become depressed, and that is why it's a very ambiguous it's a very ambiguous category to really, for doctors and scientists to speak on and diagnose. So a measure of a good theory is not the number of people who believe it to be true, right? So according to a 2009 Gallup poll, only 61% of Canadians and only 39% of Americans believe in the theory of evolution, despite the fact that it is the most plausible, rigorously tested theory of biological change and diversity, right? So, correct, right? Not another good way that in science we don't believe everything just because your friends or your mom or your uncle told you that it's correct, right? There is a way that we go about testing these things and making it falsifiable, right? So let's get into what a pseudoscience is. All right, we're going to go through all the definitions here and talk about them, right? So a pseudoscience is an idea that is presented as science but does not actually utilize basic principles of scientific thinking or procedure. Incidentally, a 2005 Gallup poll found that 25% of Canadians, 17% of males, and 33% of females believe that the position of the stars in the sky can affect a person's behavior, right? So that is a pseudoscience, which is essentially, it goes back to what we discussed about astrology, right? Astrology can sometimes be very vague and not use the same principles of science that we're accustomed to. So we'll be moving on from there. So let's talk about the biopsychosocial method or model, and then we'll get into the quick quiz that you all can pause and do. So the biopsychosocial model, right? So let's zoom in here. So because our thoughts and behaviors have multiple influences, psychologists adopt multiple perspectives to understand them. The biopsychosocial model is a means, so let's highlight this here. It's a means of explaining behavior as a product of biology, psychology, and sociocultural factors, right? So this is exactly what we touched on earlier, right as we began reading the text, is that the biopsychosocial model there's three components to it, and this is essentially the three components that comprise of the science of psychology, right? It's a mixture of biology, psychology, and sociocultural factors, right? Biological influences on our behavior involve brain structures and chemicals, hormones, and external substances such as drugs. Psychological influences involve our memories, emotions, and personalities, right? So these are things that for some people may be linked to good things or may be linked to some traumas. And how these factors shape the way we think about and respond to different people and situations. Finally, social factors such as our family, peers, ethnicity, and culture can have a huge effect on our behavior. Importantly, none of these levels of analysis exists on its own. In fact, these levels influence each other. The firing of brain cells can influence how we think and remember information. This in turn can affect how we interact with family members or how we respond to social situations like a concert. But these influences can occur in the other direction as well. Social situations can affect how we think. So let's go over here, which in turn can trigger the release of chemicals and hormones in our brain. Right, so for example, what this is referring to is if we're getting annoyed, maybe the chemicals in our brain could go off, such as serotonin or dopamine, right? These are the hormones in the brain. And essentially the take-home message of this section is every moment of your life, every waking moment of your day is taking place at these three components of the biopsychosocial model. And it is triggering either the good or the bad in your brain, either chemical or hormone, right? So psychologists have taken up the exciting challenge of trying to understand them. Indeed, behavior can be fully explained only if multiple perspectives and their interactions are investigated. This system's perspective will become particularly apparent as you read about psychological research that tackles complex topics, right? So that's a key takeaway from the biopsychosocial model, is that there are three components to it, and that there are, at every moment in our life, essentially we're being influenced by these three models, right? So here's a quick quiz that you guys can take a look at, right, on the scientific method. So a testable prediction about processes that can be observed and measured is referred to. I'll let you guys answer that. I'll post the answers in the comments below. A theory or prediction is falsifiable if there's options A through D, and that'll be posted below. How would you apply the biopsychosocial model to a news report claiming that anxiety is caused by being around other people who are anxious, right? And the hypothesis that exercise improves memory ability is a scientific one. We can post those in the comments below for you to read, right? So here's a great diagram on the biopsychosocial model, and I know we talked about it briefly, but we can look through the perspective, focus, and examples of all three components of the biopsychosocial model, right? So the perspective of the biological section is essentially your genes, your brain, the anatomy, and the function and evolution. That's your biology. And as you can see here, it highlights your DNA here and your brain. And good examples of this, so that you get a better understanding, is genetics of behavior and psychological disorders, brain behavior relationships, and drug effects. Okay. The perspective from the psychological component is behavior, perception, thought, and experience, right? And good examples of all these things are your language, memory, decision making, and your personality. Okay. Now, the sociocultural perspective here would be interpersonal relationships, families, groups, societies, and ethnicities, right? The examples would be attraction, attitudes and stereotypes, and even conformity. So building scientific literacy, right? So a major aim of this specific textbook, but also of the Human Mind Project here, is to teach you the theoretical foundations, concepts, and applicable skills that are central to the field of psychology. This book is also designed to help you develop scientific theory, the ability to understand, analyze, and apply scientific information. So scientific literacy is very easy to break down, right? So this chapter, and even after I post this talk or this recap of this chapter, is that we are going to learn how to think like scientists, right? We're going to learn critical thinking, and we're going to learn how to analyze and break down different scientific literature, because it's very important. If you're, even aside from being an academic, it's very important to know this skill in daily life, right? So let's see here. What do we have? Scientific literacy. So scientific literacy has several key components, starting with the ability to learn new information. Certainly this text will provide you with new terminology and concepts, but you will continue to encounter psychological and scientific terminology long after you have completed this course. Being scientifically literate means that you will be able to read and interpret new terminology, or know where to go to find out more. Memorizing different terms is not enough to make someone scientifically literate. Now, this is a key point here. I understand that now I'm going through different definitions for in this text and giving you different small examples, but every term that I'm giving you, it's important that you understand how to break it down into layman's terms so that you also understand it. And we also have to examine whether the ideas being presented are scientifically tested and whether those studies were designed properly. It is absolutely essential that we ask such questions. Doing so allows us to separate the information that we should find convincing from the information that we should view with caution. It will also allow you to better analyze the information presented to you by politicians, corporations, and the media. So this here is exactly what I had mentioned earlier, that everything in science has to be broken down by critical thinking. And when you have scientific literacy, when you understand scientific literacy, you can break down information that is even outside of a scientific realm, right? Of even outside of social sciences, right? That can apply to politics, corporate, your corporate business and the media, right? And this will make it more difficult for these groups to influence your behavior, right? So here we go. We can actually, yeah, this is a very important section, especially if you're a young academic, right? So what do we know about effective studying techniques? So before we even get into this section, right, what this book is talking about is essentially mass learning and then distributed learning. So your mass learning is essentially when you're cramming the night before, you're taking all that knowledge and you're just amassing it and hoping everything sticks in your brain, versus the distributed learning, which would be, when you listen to the ideas, for example, in this video, and you learn about what we talked about and the definitions we talked about on day 1, and then you come back to it on day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, and then just before your exam, you've had distributed learning because you've reviewed this video and the definitions over and over again, right? And we're going to get into which way is the best way to study, and also, there's scientific evidence here to back it up, right? So let's get into it. In the first stage of the scientific literary model, we attempt to gather the available knowledge about the topic that we're investigating, which in this case, as I've already mentioned before, is massed versus distributed study techniques. As you've likely noticed, many high school and university courses, including your psychology course, require you to learn definitions and factual information, such as the names of famous psychologists. However, students differ on how they attempt to remember this information for exams, and we hope beyond that time, many students use what is called massed learning. They perform all of their studying for an exam in one lengthy session. Another approach is spaced or distributed learning, right? Which is having shorter study sessions but spreading them over several days. Which technique would we prefer? Now, stepping away from the text here, as a former student, obviously I know that schedules can be busy, so sometimes we do massed learning. However, mass learning is not the best way to study. When you spread out your studying over different study sessions, perhaps shorter study sessions, your mind can focus and it's not anxious with trying to cram everything in. Right? So it is likely because it seems easier. It's referring to mass learning. It may even give you the sense that it's more effective than distributed learning. There are actually the two strategies are not equally effective, sorry. Distributed learning is the better of the two, right? And distributed learning is what I prefer and recommend to all of you. And we'll get into why distributed learning is better, right? So how can science explain the difference? In the second stage of the scientific literacy model, we examine whether the information that is available about a topic has been tested in scientific studies, okay? In our example, massed and distributed learning have been studied by psychologists for almost a century. Okay, in a typical study, experimental participants read a list of words or a passage of text and then complete a test assessing their memory for what they read. In some cases, the participants read the same list of words repeatedly, massed learning, whereas in other cases, there are delays in between the participants' reading of the lists. The results of such studies have consistently shown that memory is better when you spread out your study sessions, and it cites the study here, Terry, 1982. For example, in one study that was conducted by Nate Cornell in 2009, a group of 20 student volunteers learned pairs of synonyms, so effulgent and brilliant, by using flashcards, a common study tool all participants completed, one test in which they used massed learning and one test in which they used distributed or spaced learning. Each pair of synonyms was presented 4 times. However, the amount of time between each of these presentations was manipulated by the experimenter. In the distributed condition, participants went through a large stack of 20 synonyms. Thus, there were 20 trials separating one exposure to the synonym from the next. In contrast, in the massed condition, participants were given small stacks of 5 synonyms after going through a stack 4 times. They were then given the next stack of 5 synonyms. Therefore, there were only 5 trials separating one exposure to the synonym from the next. At the end of the study period, the researcher administered a memory test and discovered that the volunteers could remember significantly more words from the spaced condition than from the massed condition, right? So just to take a quick break here and break that down, if I was to show you a bunch of flashcards with different, for example, they use synonyms here, right? And I showed you them at rapid fire, you were less likely to remember them because you're massing it, you're cramming it in. Whereas if I showed you the 20 synonyms, but I showed you, let's say 5 and then waited 2 minutes and showed you another 5 and then another 2 minutes and showed you another 5 synonyms, you were more likely to remember those synonyms after the breakdown period, which is the distributed learning version, right? And this experiment is transferable because when you're studying or when you're doing your work, you should break things down like this, right? However, it is interestingly to note that the participants thought they performed better in the mass learning session. From these results, the experimenter concluded that it is better to study by using the spaced or distributed practice, right? So that's very key to understand, right? So if we can skip right to why this is relevant, right? So in the final stage of the scientific literacy model, we attempt to apply the results to situations outside of the laboratory. For instance, you would ideally apply this knowledge about massed and distributed learning to your own experience as a student. Each chapter you read in this text includes definitions, and there is a set of flashcards available with the online tools accompanying this text at My Psych Lab. Now you can go on My Psych Lab and you can get those definitions. I'm not sure if it's a paid site still, but it's really, really useful, especially if you're looking to study these different scientific definitions, right? So perhaps you will consider the distributed learning method when applying key terms for each module. This technique would probably also be useful in other courses, such as history, where you may need to match dates and major historical events, or even in a foreign language course, where you are learning new vocabulary and verb conjugations. Distributed learning has also proven useful in many clinical contexts, such as helping people improve their memory abilities after suffering a traumatic brain injury, which was cited at Hillary et al. 2003, Sometimes simple experiments can have widespread implications, and that's something to remember. And this is something that we will get into this last statement here, that these simple experiments can have widespread implications, and that is something that we'll dive deep into. Okay. So we're going to get into critical thinking, like I mentioned when I started, and a dose of healthy skepticism. So people are confronted with more information on a daily basis than at any other point in our history. Some of it is credible and can be used to help guide your decisions or behavior, but we also must deal with claims, often but not always, made by people trying to sell you things that are not always true, right? So here are examples of some claims that you should approach with your critical thinking caps and healthy skepticism. So, for example, if someone says this political party will not base its positions on public opinion polls, right? Why is that? Why wouldn't a political party not want to base its position on the opinion polls of its voters, right? You would want to break that down with your critical thinking lens on. These remedies were developed by ancient cultures and have been used for centuries, right? I've heard this my whole life, right? And maybe you have as well. These remedies may be ancient, and maybe the ancient cultures used it, but just because it's been around for a long time doesn't necessarily mean it's right for me or you. And that's the critical thinking that you should apply when you hear this, right? So if a dating site says join now and find your soulmate, I'm sure that there are tons of people that have met their soulmate on a dating site, but there are also maybe even more people that have had horror experiences or don't meet the right people on dating sites, right? So we have to approach it with a grain of salt and with healthy skepticism. These are great examples that will apply to the text I'm about to read you, right? So misinformation can sometimes seem far more abundant than accurate information, which is why it is important to develop critical thinking skills, right? So how do we break down the actual textbook definition? I'm just going to highlight this here of critical thinking. So it involves exercising curiosity and skepticism when evaluating the claims of others and with our own assumptions and beliefs, right? So that is critical thinking essentially. So the way I just broke down those three statements above is exactly how you're going to break down any further statements that come to you or anything in science and in life. You're going to want to use your critical thinking, which involves your healthy curiosity and healthy skepticism and evaluating the claims that other people are presenting to you. The ability to think critically can be learned and developed, but most of us need to make a conscious effort to do so. Research points to a core set of habits and skills for developing critical thinking, right? So here are the core skills here. There's 6 of them, and I will go over all of them with you. So you want to be curious, right? Simple answers are sometimes too simple, and common sense is not always correct. For example, giving your brain some time to rest after having a stroke, right? It actually hinders rather than helps your recovery. And that would seem like common sense, but this makes sense because, right, you're going to want to work your brain, obviously not overwork your brain if you've just had a stroke, but you're going to want to work your brain a healthy amount because you've just had a stroke and you don't want the function of your brain to be lost. Right, so obviously be curious, right? Number 2, you want to examine the nature and source of the evidence. So not all research is of equal quality. For example, you will likely find a more accurate account of prejudiced attitudes if you use a subtle experimental technique than if you directly ask people whether they have these attitudes, right? So when you examine the nature of the source, right? What the text is saying is that if we were examining prejudiced behaviors, if we were to ask people directly if they're prejudiced or racist, They're highly likely to not admit that, obviously, openly. But if we had a more subtle way of measuring that, we could probably bring out and find the answer, um, and get right. So if we had a study that said we found, how to tell if people are prejudiced by just straight up asking them, um, the nature of that source of evidence might not be as accurate as if we used a subtler way, right? So number 3 is examine assumptions and biases. This includes your own assumptions as well as the assumptions of those making claims. Research examining the impact of human behavior on climate change may be biased if it is funded by oil companies. So examine your assumptions and your biases. Like the text is saying, if an oil company is going to do a study on climate change, they're likely to be biased towards that topic because the work that they're doing may be harmful to climate change and the overall earth, right? So number 4 would be avoid overly emotional thinking. Now, this goes towards everything that we do in science, everything that you do, even in your own life. You want to eliminate as much emotion as possible, especially in scientific thinking. There's very little room for anecdotal evidence and anecdotal feeling and thinking, right? So we can go to number 5 too. We have to be able to tolerate ambiguity. So what does this mean? When you tolerate ambiguity, it means that sometimes we could conduct a study and there's multiple meanings right at the end of it, right? So for example, the what we even touched on earlier in the text, and it cites it here too, is what are the factors leading to depression, right? So there are multiple factors that are leading to depression. It's an ambiguous how do you say it? It's an ambiguous study, right? It's a long-standing study of what causes depression. However, scientists have not been able to pinpoint just one specific reason as to why people get depressed. And we also can't pinpoint just one specific onset in someone's life of that depression. So that's part of the science. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, is that we have to tolerate ambiguity. So we also must be able to consider alternative viewpoints and alternative interpretations of the evidence. For example, it is clear that we require sleep in order to function properly. However, there are several theories that can explain the functions that sleep serves, right? So in everything with science, there are alternative interpretations, right? A good example of this could be the keto diet, let's say. One scientist or one doctor may say this is very healthy for you. You don't need carbs. Whereas another study might cite and say, no, this is actually really harmful to people with certain conditions, right? So it's really important to consider alternative viewpoints. If you follow these steps, you'll be well on your way to developing critical thinking habits and skills. However, determining what does not constitute critical thinking is important as well. Critical thinking is not a philosophy, a belief, or a faith, nor is it meant to make everyone arrive at the same answer. Complex issues often remain ambiguous, right? So this is very important in science, that complex issues do often remain ambiguous, unfortunately. Things like depression, things like climate change, you name it, right? Social issues, right? But that also can be examined by social scientists. They're all complex issues with differing opinions, and they may remain ambiguous forever, probably. And at times, a question may have several plausible answers. Although critical thinking cannot guarantee a correct answer, and sometimes it even delivers unpleasant ones, it will help find and justify good answers. Critical thinking means considering other viewpoints, but it also means that some ideas can be incorrect. In many cases, one answer emerges as the best one because a large body of evidence converges upon it. Critical thinking does not mean being negative or arbitrarily critical. It simply means that you intentionally examine knowledge, beliefs, and the means by which conclusions were obtained. Put another way, right? Critical thinking involves cautious skepticism. We are constantly being told about amazing products that help us control body weight, improve thinking and memory, enhance sexual performance, and so on. As consumers, there are always going to be claims we really hope to be true. But as critical thinkers, we meet these claims with a good dose of skepticism, right? So, for example, here, is there sound evidence that this diet helps people achieve and maintain a healthy weight? So, whoops, dropped my mouse there. Let me get that. So, is there evidence? That's actually funny because we just discussed the keto diet, right? Is there sound evidence that this diet helps people to achieve and maintain a healthy weight? Obviously, you have to be skeptical and challenging, and you want to ask for the best evidence possible, right? You're going to want to do your research with anything, not just a diet, right? That's the whole point of this text, right? So often the great products or the miracle cures that we have always hoped for really are too good to be true. And I totally agree with that, right? There are some times where you can lose weight in 30 days, but it took you 10 years to gain all this weight, but this product is guaranteeing you 30 days to lose all the weight. Doesn't really match up, right? However, the main point is being curious and skeptical means or leads you to ask important questions about the science underlying such claims. Doing so leads us to search for and evaluate evidence, which is never a bad thing, right? All right, this is actually a really important part here. The myths of the mind, which is, people's beliefs toward aliens, right? So occasionally we hear claims about alien abductions, right? So I can leave this text up here and you guys can read it, but I can, quickly go through it, right? So they did a study basically on people who were likely to believe in alien abductions being real versus people who didn't believe in it, right? So no one has ever really come back and said this is what happened, in our alien abductions. But ultimately, what they found was that people who did believe in alien abductions were more likely to suffer from sleep paralysis. Okay, and we can read a little bit about this and get into why that's the case, and even the principle of parsimony, right? So, scientific and critical thinking involve the use of the principle of parsimony, which means that the simplest of all competing explanations, the most parsimonious of a phenomenon, should be the one we accept. Is there a simpler explanation for alien abductions? Probably so. Psychologists who study alien abduction cases have discovered some interesting patterns. Firstly, historical reports of abductions typically spike just after the release of a science fiction movie, right? So that's also one thing I forgot to mention. Science fiction movies, maybe they bring out the excitement in people's fantasy for space aliens, right? Details of the reports often follow specific details seen in these movies, which was cited in a study by Clancy in 2005. Secondly, it probably would not be too surprising to learn that people who report being abducted are prone to fantasizing and having false memories, right? So, people who do believe they were abducted by aliens, through the study that's cited in the text down below here, they were found to have false memories, and they typically had a lot of fantasizing, which led their reality to maybe be a little bit skewed, right? So finally, people who claim to have been abducted are likely to experience sleep paralysis, waking up and becoming aware of being unable to move, a temporary state that is not unusual. and hallucinations while in the paralyzed state. You can likely see how these three factors could explain reports of alien abductions. Following the principle of parsimony typically leads to real, though sometimes less spectacular answers. Although these answers might leave the so-called abductees feeling alienated, right? So we can do a little quiz here again. I can leave this up here on the screen for you all to take a look at, and then I can always drop the answers down below, right? So someone who exercises curiosity and skepticism about assumptions and belief is using critical thinking, in my opinion, but I'll get to the right answer. Scientific literacy does not include, you can answer that. And then there's a scenario question here. I won't read it because it's too much, but if you pause the video, go through it, it's really good practice. And obviously I can post the answers for everybody. So that's the ending of 1.1. So there are the key terminologies that you're going to want to learn here is, and this is just for, your foundation into the psychology, but also as the founder of the Human Mind Project here, we want you to build on these as your foundation into psychology, which is the key terminology of the scientific method, right? So we went through the biopsychosocial model, we went through critical thinking, we went through your hypothesis, we went through pseudoscience, we went through psychology, the definition, we went through scientific literacy, we went through the scientific method, and then we also went through a theory, right? These are going to build on your foundation to science and to psychology, right? So we can jump down to 1.2, right? And we can get into the ancient kind of science on psychology. Interestingly enough, at the Human Mind Project, we will touch on this, that the actual science of psychology is very young. It's probably only about 106, 107 years old. It's really, really young and it's new. And the treatments and the developments and the research is always ongoing. That's why 20 years ago, how we treated depression versus 20 years later is very, very different, right? So we can get into the focus questions again. So why did it take so long for scientists to start applying their methods to human thoughts and experience? What has resulted from the application of scientific methods to human behaviors, right? So when we try to imagine, the earliest investigations of human behavior, we rarely think about axe wounds to the head. As it turns out, we should. The ancient Egyptians were a fierce military force for several centuries. The wealth accumulated during these military campaigns filled the palaces of the pharaohs with gold and jewels, and allowed them to construct massive monuments like the pyramids. But one side effect of having many battles was that memories of the Egyptian army also suffered many injuries, including some to the head. Although the primitive medical knowledge of the time condemned most injured patients to death, some did in fact survive and attempted to return to their normal lives. However, as one might expect, when someone has suffered an axe wound to the head, such attempts were not always successful. Similar problems had likely occurred in earlier times. What makes ancient Egypt stand out is that military doctors noticed and documented patterns that emerged in their patients, as noted in the Edwin Smith papyrus. So essentially, I won't go through the whole text because it's a full summary, but the ancient Egyptians used the brain-damaged soldiers as a way to look at different parts of the brain and different impairments, right? And how, if you got hit in one part of the brain, it affected your vision. The other part affected your memory severely. The other part affected your speech. It's a very primitive way, obviously, but it was the entry into the study of psychology, which is what we want to teach you here at the Human Mind Project. So, psychology's philosophical and scientific origins. This is going to be super important for us to get into, okay? So, science is more than a body of facts to memorize or a set of subjects to study. Science is actually a philosophy of knowledge that stems from two fundamental beliefs: empiricism and determinism. So, empiricism is a philosophical tenet that knowledge comes through experience, right? That is empiricism. And the best way you can remember that is that it's your knowledge coming through experience. Empiricism starts with an E, and we can link it to experience. Best way to memorize it, right? So seeing is believing. But in the scientific sense, empiricism means that knowledge about the world is based on careful observation, not on common sense or speculation, right? Versus determinism. Determinism is the belief that all events are governed by lawful cause and effect relationships. That's very empiricism and determinism, very, very easy terms to understand and remember, easy concepts. So determinism, right, is that all your events are governed by cause and effect. What we do now determines what happens later. Simple, right? This is easy enough when we discuss natural laws such as gravity. We probably all agree that if you drop an object, it will fall, right? But does the lawfulness of nature apply to the way we think and act? Interesting concept, right? Does it mean that we do not have control over our own actions? This interesting philosophical debate is often referred to as free will versus determinism. While we certainly feel as if we are in control of our own behaviors, that is, we sense that we have free will, there are compelling reasons to believe that some of our behaviors are determined. The level of determinism or free will psychologists attribute to humans is certainly debated, right? So influences from the ancient philosophical insights into behavior. As you read in the opening section of the model, ancient Egyptian doctors noticed that damage to different brain areas led to vastly different impairments. While such an observation marked the first recorded linking of biology and behavior, it was not the only important insight to come out of ancient societies. In ancient Greece, the physician Hippocrates developed the world's first personality classification scheme. The ancient Greeks believed that 4 humors or fluids flowed throughout the body and influenced both health and personality. These 4 humors included blood, yellow bile, and black bile, and phlegm. So different combinations of these 4 humors were thought to lead to specific moods and behaviors. Right, so as you can see, where we are as a science now in psychology is we don't even use these 4 humors, right? But at one point, the ancient Greeks determined how someone was feeling based off of these 4 humors. And that can just show you how long ago that was and how hard it must have been if someone was dealing with their mental illness or dealing with a sudden mood change to be suddenly attributed to something like a yellow bile or a black bile and phlegm. It's very hard to indicate what that would be, right? So Hippocrates' more general work and suggested that the 4 humors combine to create temperaments or emotional and personality characteristics that remain stable throughout the lifetime. Galen's 4 temperaments, each related to a humor, included the sanguine, which is blood, and that's Latin, so you can fully understand. You can easily remember that if you speak Spanish, French, Italian, you'll easily remember that. And what they linked the blood to was a tendency to be impulsive, pleasure-seeking, and charismatic, right? And I'm just going to go on a limb here and maybe guess that that's what they mean when someone says they're very hot-blooded, right? So your caloric humor, which was your yellow bile, is a tendency to be ambitious, energetic, and a bit aggressive. Melancholic was your black bile, which is a tendency to be independent, perfectionistic, and a bit introverted. And your phlegmatic is a tendency to be quiet, relaxed, and content with life. So that's exactly what these four biles worked out to be. Um, I mean, just from understanding where the science is now, and where most of you viewers might understand where the science is now, that's incredibly hard to believe that they actually gauged people's behaviors based on these four humors. But nonetheless, that is the history of it, right? So, like Hippocrates, Galen recognized that the temperaments of most people would be a combination of these extremes. He went on to provide detailed descriptions of how different temperaments could be combined in his book, which is here, the De Temperamentis. Although such a classification system is primitive by modern standards, the work of Hippocrates and Galen moved the understanding of human behavior forward by attempting to categorize different types of personalities. We will see much more scientifically rigorous attempts to do the same thing later in this book. So, Roman and later Persian physicians also attempted to link different foods with different humors. Cold foods led to an increase in phlegm humor, which honestly I think holds ground to this day. So, if a person's humors were out of balance, leading to a physical or emotional problem, a dietary adjustment was sometimes advised to help him or her return to a balanced state. So we don't follow this to a T, but there are times where if you're sick, you're not going to eat cold foods, right? Maybe you'll eat something warmer, more comforting, right? However, the golden age of Greek and Roman thought came to a crashing halt in the latter parts of the 4th century. This was the beginning of the Dark Ages, a time in which few medical or scientific advances were made. In fact, some of Galen's medical teachings were suppressed, often being replaced by religious texts or philosophy that was consistent with the views of religious leaders, right? And that's cited here by Gross in 98. And so, as you can see throughout the Dark Ages, right, psychology was actually tied in with religion, right? Which, as you know now, we try to keep those two things separate. But you can just imagine people who suffered with their mental illnesses during the Dark Ages or pre-Dark Ages. It would have been very hard to get treatment, right? So we can even look at what the definition of a zeitgeist is, which is it refers to a general set of beliefs of a particular culture at a specific time in history. It can be used to understand why some ideas take off immediately, whereas other perfectly good ideas may go unnoticed for years. Right? The power of this zeitgeist can be very strong, and there are several ways it prevented psychological science from emerging in the 1600s. Perhaps most important is the people were not ready to accept a science that could be applied to human behavior and thought. To the average person of the 1600s, viewing human behavior as the result of predictable physical laws was troubling. Doing so would seem to imply the philosophy of materialism, the belief that humans and other living beings are composed exclusively of physical matter, right? So this actually makes perfectly good sense. If you break this down, right, it took a while for a science like psychology to catch on because people couldn't accept the science, right, that could be applied to human behavior and to human thought. And why is that? Because unlike, let's say, another science where we can pull an organ out, obviously you can pull your brain out, but you can't see the thoughts, right? If we pull out the heart, we can see physical conditions wrong with it. Let's say if there is something wrong with it, your hands, your arms, things like that. Those sciences are different in the sense that there was no way to treat how you approach the mind. How do you approach things like thought? It was very, very different at that time. So, although most early thinking about the mind and behavior remained philosophical in nature, scientific methods were generating great discoveries for the natural sciences of physics, biology, and physiology. This meant that the early influences on psychology came from the natural and physical sciences, right? And that's that's not exactly good in the sense for psychology, because the early influences on the study of the mind and thought came from physical sciences, right? So that's not going to give us the accuracy that maybe we're looking for in today's day and age, right? And this will be the last section we go over before we jump to the next video. So if we look at the influences from physics and experimenting with the mind, the initial forays into scientific psychology were conducted by physicists and physiologists. One of the earliest explorations was made by Gustav Fechner, who studied sensation and perception as a physicist. Fechner was interested in the natural world of moving objects and energy. He turned his knowledge to psychological questions about how the physical and mental worlds interact. Fechner coined the term psychophysics, which is the study of the relationship between the physical world and the mental representation of that world, right? As an example of the psychophysical research, imagine you are holding a 1 pound weight in your right hand and a 5 pound weight in your left hand. Obviously, your left hand will feel the heavier weight, but that is not what interested Fechner. What if a researcher places a 1/4 pound weight in each hand, resting on top of the weight that is already there? Fechner wanted to know which of the 1/4 pound weights would be perceived as heavier. Oddly enough, although both weigh the same amount, the 1/4 pound weight in your right hand will be more noticeable than the 1/4 pound weight added to your left hand, almost as if it were easier. Through experiments like these, Fechner demonstrated basic principles of how the physical and mental worlds interact. In fact, he developed an equation to precisely calculate the perceived change in weight, and then extended. We'll just go down here. Here is the actual scientific diagram. He extended this formula to apply to changes in brightness, loudness, and other perceptual experiences. This work served as the foundation of the modern study of perception, right? So that's what Fechner was very much interested in, right? And the influences from evolutionary theory and adaptive functions of behavior, that's probably where we'll pick up next time. So again, we went through the foundations. The Human Mind Project, here, our channel is focused on giving you guys the foundations into science, into psychology, and we gave you a good base on the starting definitions on critical thinking, and we also we went through a little brief history on the beginning of psychology, how it started with the ancient Egyptians, and then how the four humors came into play, and then how there were minimal advancements in the Dark Ages to psychology up until we get to the Gustav Fechner part, where he makes advances in the science of physics and perception and psychology. Okay, so you can go over this again. We'll be posting this text in the description below, but we will also post the answers to the small quizzes, and then we will also go over more of this early history of psychology to add to your foundation that we just put in this video. All right.